This program is a part of the Full Press Radio Network. Find this and all of Full Press Coverage's shows on fullpressradio.com or free on the Full Press Coverage app, available now on the Apple and Google Play stores.
Hey, this is Sal Palantonio of ESPN, and you're listening to Ira and Clark on the Eye Test for Two podcast.
Well, I tell you what, guys, I'm going to stand up and shout, welcome to the Eye Test for Two podcast. I'm Clark Judge.
I'm Ira Kaufman.
And we're both Hall of Fame voters, as you should know by now. And now we're joined by, yes, our Hall of Fame producer, as we always are. That would be Ian Glendon, and resident Tom Brady lapdog. And before we go farther, guys, I'll just let you know, for our listeners, that intro was the 1979 original Tampa Bay Bucs song. Now, Ian and Ira both live in the Tampa area. Ira lives in Tampa, covered the Bucs, covers them today. Ian moved down from New England, correct, Ian? And lives in St. Petersburg, Florida. So he's in the Tampa Bay area. And guys, be honest, you both stood up and saluted that fight song, didn't you?
My heart is racing over there, Clark. It's racing.
Only to be rivaled by San Diego Supercharger song.
Oh, now you're going close to my heart. I love that too. Well, anyway, both these guys, as I said, live in the Tampa Bay area, and the Super Bowl is going to be there in a week and a half. And the Tampa Bay Bucs, or Ian, should I call them the Tampa Bay Bucs? They're going to be in it for the first time that a Super Bowl team hosts a Super Bowl in its home stadium. Now, before we get to our guest, I want to ask you quickly, because I thought that was very cool what happened last week. A lot of historic moments, but especially that Super Bowl coming back to the host stadium. What's the mood down there in Tampa? Ira, you live there. I mean, I lived in New York. If it were the Giants, they'd be honking horns in Manhattan. What's the mood down there in Tampa?
Well, the mood down there is thousands of people coming out at midnight Sunday night to greet the Tampa Bay Bucs at the airport. When Brady's car went by, they stopped in front of it. They wouldn't let him go any further. They wanted to yank him out of the car and hug him.
I think I saw Ian there. Ian was there, wasn't he?
and Gary was there with a tape recorder. Can I get a couple of words over there, Tom? But it's pandemonium. But Clark, having said that, it's a little bit muted, more so than it would be normally. You don't see the public signs of affection, the gatherings at the bars. But believe me, there is Buck fever raging down here. And Clark, I never thought little Tampa, Florida would be the sports capital of America, with the Lightning winning the Cup.
Right.
The Rays got to the World Series, and the Bucs have already made history. Clark, it's quite a time for a Tampa Bay sports fan.
Yeah, I think the people in LA might quibble with you there, Ira, with the Dodgers and the Lakers, and the Rams weren't so good. But anyway, Ian, I've got a question for you before we move on. Have you gone out? I mentioned that you were in New England. Have you gone out yet and replaced your Patriots number 12 jersey with a Bucs number 12 jersey? I don't see you wearing it today.
No, I won't do that. Maybe after his career's over, I might add it to the collection with the Michigan and Patriots jersey, but I will not wear a Bucs jersey. Sorry, Bucs fans.
Yeah, well, good thing Ira's not wearing it either, because he's got to be in the press box for the Super Bowl. Well, speaking of Tom Brady, you guys are both in for a treat today, because we have with us today, in fact, we have it with us right now, Hall of Fame voter who knows more about Tom Brady than most people in the media, almost anyone in the media, and almost anyone outside the Tom Brady domicile, and that's Gary Myers. Gary and I go way back to 1982 when I was covering the Colts and he was covering the Cowboys. They made a trade for a kicker. We go that far back, 4 decades. Anyway, Gary wrote the best-selling book, Brady versus Manning, and he now hosts the GOAT Tom Brady podcast. And Gary, first of all, thanks for joining us. And I'll tell you, nice timing. How good for you and your podcast that here we have Tom Brady at the age of 43 in his fourth Super Bowl in the past 5 years. Already 2021 is better than 2020 for you, right?
You know, it's pretty amazing when when my Brady Manning book came out, well, just as I was finishing it, Brady and the Patriots beat the Seahawks. 3 months after it came out, Brady and Manning played in the AFC Championship game, and then Manning won the Super Bowl. And the following year, Brady won the Super Bowl. And now, as my podcast is going on, Brady makes it to another Super Bowl. So this is a little bit of an advertisement right now. If there's a quarterback out there that wants to play in the Super Bowl, contact me to write your book or do your podcast, and it's a virtual guarantee.
Hey, Ian, could we do that podcast next? I'd like to jump ahead of him in line here and get a podcast lined up with, I don't know, Matt Stafford, somebody. Let's get somebody else in here. Aaron Rodgers, wherever he's going to play next year. Hey, Gary, question for you. And I've talked to you this week about it, but the fact that he's in his 10th Super Bowl, and we know all the achievements, but the age of 43, he's in his 10th Super Bowl. I don't know if it matters whether he wins it or loses it. The fact that he's there, and it's in Tampa, in the stadium where they play, the first time anyone's done it, and it's Tom Brady. Do you consider this the greatest achievement of his career, or do we have to wait another week and a half to see what transpires in the Super Bowl?
Well, with all due respect to the Bucks and having won the Super Bowl in 2002, he took over a team that was considered dysfunctional and has been considered dysfunctional almost from the time that they came into the league. So turning around the culture, changing people's perspective on this team in 4 months is pretty incredible. Now, he did walk into a situation where they had a lot of talent on that team, but to do what he's done this year is pretty amazing. Does he need to win the Super Bowl to be his most incredible accomplishment, just getting this far? Clark, as I mentioned to you once before, I think, taking over in New England when he did, an 0-2 team that had been 5-11 the year before, when Drew Bledsoe got injured. And although he was more of a game manager that year, and he threw only 3 passes as a rookie the year before, I think that still stands out to me as his most incredible accomplishment, considering that he had a game-winning drive at the end to lead to Vinatieri's field goal to beat the Rams, who were favored by like 14 or 15 points. Yeah. Here, before the season, if you were going to ask me if I'd be shocked if the Bucs got to the Super Bowl, I would probably say no. I mean, you look at the offensive talent around him. They have a good defense. It was really a ready-made situation. So it was just a question of, could he overcome not having an off season, and how long would it take for his philosophy of offense and the way he liked to run it mesh with Bruce Arians? After 12 games at 7-5, I think it was kind of a mess, but they got it together during the bye week. Ari, I mean, you're there, something must have happened during the bye week where they threw out all the plays that weren't working and they identified the plays that were working, and they've won 7 in a row since then. But
I think Gary's exactly
really answer your question. I think that I would still count 2001 as his greatest accomplishment, whether or not he wins this Super Bowl.
Gary, I want to ask you something about the aura surrounding Tom Brady. And I think you'd agree with me, Gary, that there's certain athletes, not many. Tiger Woods springs to mind. Michael Jordan springs to mind. That attracts the casual sports fan, Gary, the casual sports fan. And Brady is in that group, and it's a small group. Gary, is it all because of the rings, or is there something surrounding the Tom Brady story that interests the casual sports fan?
Well, Ira, I don't think it's hurt that he's married to one of the more recognizable women in the world. So when you put the two of them together, they're quite a power couple. But he was already reaching that status before he even met her. But I think being with her has kind of enhanced his visibility, going to a lot of different events together. And, photographers are much more interested in them together as a couple than maybe they would be with either one of individually. But I think his story also is very appealing to people, where he walked onto the campus at University of Michigan. He was a 7th string quarterback. Despite a 20-5 record at the University of Michigan, he gets drafted in the 6th round, 199th player, 7th quarterback taken, 7th player taken by the Patriots that year. So it's like, okay, Belichick identified that maybe he could be the end of the roster player, a 3rd-string quarterback. But if he thought he was going to be great, he wouldn't have picked 6 players ahead of him in that draft and another player ahead of him in the 6th round of that draft. I think you put all these factors together, combined with the rings, which obviously validates him, and he is an iconic figure. And a lot of people hold him up on a much higher level than, say, Peyton Manning, who has a zillion commercials. I just think that Tom is looked upon differently.
Gary, I want to congratulate you. You've written some very, very entertaining, informative books, Gary, and there's more books in your future. Gary, question: how did you crack the Brady inner circle? You know, he at times is a very private guy, Gary. How'd you gain his confidence and his trust?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, Ira. I had known him a little bit before coming up with the book project, just by being around him in Super Bowls like we all have been. And then, covering a lot of Patriots-Jets games. But I was nothing more than a face in the crowd to him. I mean, I think I'd spoken to him once, one-on-one, in the first 10 years of his career. I went to training camp in the summer of 2013, and I waited for him to finish his group interview. My son was just starting 2 weeks later at Michigan as a freshman. So when Brady finished his interview, I went up and introduced myself to him again. And he had known my face, but I'm not sure he knew my name. And, I just started off talking about how my son was starting in Ann Arbor in a couple of weeks. And we just broke the ice that way. And I told him about this book project that I was thinking about doing about him and Manning, and how I looked at it as Magic versus Bird. And he loved the idea. I mean, he was very enthusiastic about the project, even though I wasn't going to do it in collaboration with them. It wasn't an as told to story. I was just doing the research, and I just needed his cooperation. And he was more than happy. Now, it turns out the Patriots called me 2 weeks later and said, okay, Tom, we'll talk to you on Thursday. Can you come back up? And I said, I'll be driving to Ann Arbor that day. And I've always had my priorities right. Family comes first. And I didn't get to talk to him again until right before. I didn't get to set up the interview with him again until right before Thanksgiving. I mean, it was 3 months later before we can find a date that he was available. And then all credit to Stacey James, the Patriots PR guy, for giving me a choice. You can talk to Tom in the quarterback meeting room after practice, and he'll give you 20 minutes because he likes to get home to his family after practice. Or you can ride with him. He was living in downtown Boston at the time. He goes, with your luck, hopefully there'll be some traffic and it'll take an hour. And then, if Tom likes the way the conversation's going, he'll probably sit with you in the car for a while, which is exactly what happened. I chose the car ride, and it was probably the best interview I've ever done in my career.
You mean outside of this?
Well, this is when I'm asking the questions. It goes without saying, this is the best interview I've ever had when I'm being asked questions.
We're with Gary Myers, who's the host of the GOAT Tom Brady podcast. And Gary, that was a smart decision, by the way, to choose to go in the car, because anyone in New England, and I live in New England, who drives 95 from Foxborough to Boston knows at 4:30 or 5:30, whenever you left, whatever it was, there's going to be traffic and it's going to be gridlock going into Boston. So you probably got a long interview there.
Well, Clark, let me just tell you this. The only downside to that ride was I left my car at Gillette, and he just dropped me at a hotel 2 blocks from his apartment, so I can take a cab back to my car. And when you write a book, the expenses come out of your pocket. There's no there's no expense account to hand that into. It was an $80 car ride, taxi ride back to my car, but it was worth the $80.
Yeah, well, I've read the book, and so is Ira. It was worth the $80 for readers too.
Well,
that was a great story. That was a really great
story.
Now, I want to follow up on Ira's question. Since you got into that inner circle, I'll just ask the obvious question: what makes this guy special in your mind? I mean, he lasted until the 199th pick in the draft. We know that. 7th string quarterback at Michigan. No one identified what was going on with him. And I know from talking to him and also to people in the 49ers, a team I covered in 2000, they had no interest in him in the draft. Remember that they drafted Gio Carmazzi with the 3rd pick and then took another quarterback later. But
Tim Rattay.
Tim Rattay, that's right. And so when I talked to Mariucci, who was then the coach of San Francisco, I said, yeah, we had him in for a workout. But it was 45 minutes and nothing was special about him. There really was nothing special. What we didn't know what was inside of him. If we had known that, what drives this guy, the competitive spirit, what drives this guy to be the best, maybe we would have drafted him. I don't know. But you've talked to him. You've watched him like the rest of us, but you are in sort of that inner circle. What makes this guy an extraordinary quarterback that others didn't see?
Well, the first thing I can tell you is that Tom Brady Sr. told me that he didn't get involved in Tom's decision where he could go to school. It was between Cal, Illinois, I believe, and Michigan. All he told him was, hey, Tom, this is not going to be your life's work. We have to be realistic about this. You're probably not going to be an NFL quarterback. So I want you to pick a school that you're proud to get a degree from. So it wasn't only the NFL that was doubting him. His dad, going into him being a freshman at Michigan, was very realistic about what he thought he had there. I mean, I'm sure Jack Elway knew that when John went to Stanford, that if he wasn't going to be the first pick in the draft, he'd be a first-round pick.
Yeah, right.
So I think Tom has kind of embraced the underdog role. Not that he wanted it, but the fact that it was such a struggle to get on the field at Michigan. And then when finally, his 4th year in the program, when he was a junior, they had recruited Drew Henson, who was a 3-sport star from not far away in Brighton, Michigan, just up the road from Ann Arbor. And, I'll tell you an interesting story that George Steinbrenner, Henson had signed that Yankee contract.
Yeah, right.
George Steinbrenner wanted him to come play baseball right away. Steinbrenner was a huge Ohio State supporter. And the feeling in Michigan was that Steinbrenner was being so aggressive trying to get Henson to play baseball because he was supposed to be like the next Elway. And so he wanted to get him out of Michigan to help Ohio State get his baseball career going. And it actually worked against Brady because Lloyd Carr, who had recruited Henson, wanted to keep Henson because he was supposed to be great. So the first year Brady was starting, he let Henson play one series a game. And then the second year, Brady's last year, Brady played the first half. Brady played the first quarter. Henson played the second quarter, and Carr would decide at halftime who would play the second half. I mean, can you imagine that? And it was only till about halfway through the season that he finally decided, I'm going with Brady the rest of the way. And then they beat Alabama in the Orange Bowl, and Brady throws for almost 400 yards, 4 touchdowns, but there was one series in the game that he put in Drew Henson in the middle of a nearly 400-yard game. So he comes into the NFL with a humongous chip on his shoulder as the 199th pick, and that has driven him his entire career. He never wanted to let Matt Castle have a snap with the first-team offense in practice because he didn't want Belichick to ever have a thought in his head that there was another quarterback that was capable of doing his job better than Brady. So I think that whole Michigan experience has really formulated his mindset through his entire career.
It's a great story, and especially where he is now, the age of 43, and the achievements, the history he's made. It's a great story. Why do so many people outside of New England really dislike this guy? And it borders on hatred too. I don't get it. I mean, you talked about, there was mention of Michael Jordan by Ira. People love Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, it's a little bit different. He's polarized people, but someone who's this good in his career, what he does, people should marvel at it and embrace it and celebrate it. Instead, they can't wait for him to fail. I don't understand that.
Well, I think part of it is he's been sucked into the evil empire in New England. Belichick is hated outside of New England.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of that, Brady has become part of that to a certain extent, by extension. I mean, it's also because he's successful. He's a nice looking guy. I think we can all admit that. We're all secure enough in our own, that the women love him, and he married, a supermodel. He's got a ton of money.
Mm-hmm.
There isn't much about his life that some people are not envious of.
Right.
And I think that we tend to, with sports heroes, to build them up just so we can try to knock them down.
Right.
And I think he's a perfect example of that.
Is it jealousy, Gary?
I can see other players being jealous of him, but just a sports fan, why would you be jealous of somebody who's got?
Because he's got everything. He's got everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think that people are jealous of that aspect of it for sure. Now, I know that Ira thinks he's much better looking than Tom, and
and you would agree. And you would agree.
Yeah, but I think there are probably some guys out there that have girlfriends that admire Tom for one reason or another, and maybe that causes some resentment. And I mean, I don't think I'm saying anything, unusual here. That there's just a lot that he has going for him that people say, well, can something go wrong for him? And maybe the only thing that they can envision going wrong for him is losing Super Bowls.
Yeah.
And
Gary, Gary, it's kind of the way other sports writers look at you, Gary. You got it all.
I don't think so, Ira, but I appreciate you saying that.
Gary, I want to get your perspective. Gary, your perspective on there's a narrative coming out of New England. You know this, and it's very popular that this was a referendum on Brady and Belichick. Let's see what's going on, separate them and see what happens. Well, we know what happened in New England. We know what happened here in Tampa. Is that too easy a narrative, Gary? Is Belichick done without Brady? I think you could make the argument, Gary, that Brady covered up a lot of problems those last few years in Foxborough.
Right.
Oh, I would definitely agree with that. When you look at the skill position players that Brady had around him, say the last 10 years, you had Gronk, who was an all-time tight end, but seemed to be hurt half the time, and Julian Edelman, who was a Super Bowl MVP, but on another team would probably just be an average receiver, and then who else would you really say was an all-pro or Pro Bowl caliber skill position player that he had? I mean, there really isn't anybody. So I do agree that Brady covered up for a lot of the shortcomings in Belichick's personnel decisions. I also think what happened this season is predictable, Ira, that if you're going to pick one team between the Bucs and Patriots that were going to struggle, certainly it would be New England. They're in a rebuilding mode. They're in transition here as Belichick tries to find – he's never going to find the next Brady, but as he tries to find himself a playoff quarterback. And Brady walks into a situation like we talked about earlier that was ready-made for success. They just need to have a quarterback who wasn't going to throw 30 interceptions. What were they, 7-9 last year with a quarterback?
Yes.
7 pick sixes or something like that. I mean, that was an indication right there. They had a lot of talent on that team. They just needed to switch out the quarterback and get him a guy that can win games rather than a guy that was going to lose games. But as far as the Brady and Belichick argument, I would look at it this way. I think that Brady needed Belichick at the beginning. First, he needed him to draft him. And then he needed him to teach him about the NFL and to develop him. And they had Charlie Weiss there, who was a really good offensive coordinator. But once it became apparent that Brady was a special player, and maybe that was in 2003 when he won his second Super Bowl, and he was going to win 2 out of the first 3 years he was a starter, then won 3 out of 4 his first years as a starter. I think we all knew at that point, covering the NFL, that Tom Brady was a pretty special player. I think from that point forward, he became much more important to New England's success than Belichick. Belichick, I don't want to say he was putting slop around him, because he did have a period there where he had Randy Moss and Wes Welker. But for the most part, he never had the weapons that, say, Peyton had in Indianapolis with Marvin Harrison and Reggie Wayne and Dallas Clark. So I think if you have to pick one that was responsible for the last 20 years in New England, and you can't just say it was a tie that needed each other, but if you had to pick one, I would definitely say it was Brady.
Gary, one more for me. Thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Gary, do you get the sense, knowing Tom the way you do and listening to him, that he kind of feels liberated and empowered with this new organization in terms of having a lot of input, a lot of clout? We know about Antonio Brown. He got Gronk. Fournette came aboard. And Brady's in the middle of all of that, Gary. He's a driving force. I'm not going to say he's the general manager of this football team, but Gary, is there a sense you can tell that Brady loves this new power that he has?
Well, for $25 million, the Bucs got themselves a quarterback and a de facto general manager. I mean, I know Jason Light is the GM, but with Fournette, I'm not sure what Tom's influence was on that, but I'm sure they talked to him about it first. Gronk and Antonio Brown would definitely, Brady telling them, I want these guys on the team. I think that he's been liberated by playing for Bruce Arians, who is a much more laid-back coach, more of a player's coach. I think early in his career, it was okay for Belichick to yell at him and make an example out of him in the team meetings and on the practice field, because Tom realized that Belichick was basically telling the team, if I can yell at Brady after winning 2 Super Bowls, after winning 3 Super Bowls, and I wasn't getting any pushback from him, then none of you guys can ever complain by me getting mad at you. And I think Brady lived with that for about 10 years. And then I think it started to wear him down. And he's going, wait a minute. I got 3 rings on my finger. I got 4, and you're still treating me as if it's 2002. When is this going to stop? And I just think he got tired of that. And he also got tired of taking a below-market contract with the idea that Belichick was going to take that money and make sure the team stayed Super Bowl caliber. And then he looked around in 2019, and he had no one to throw the ball to. And he's going, where's my money going? I've saved you all this money, but what are you spending it on? So I think getting to Tampa, again, having a ready-made team and then bringing in a couple of his buddies. I haven't talked to Tom in a while, but just, observing him in these interviews, he seems happier and looser than I have seen him in the last 10 years.
We're with Hall of Fame voter Gary Myers, who's the host of the GOAT Tom Brady podcast. And Gary, there's a documentary out there that you may be aware of, maybe not, but it's called 4 Games in the Fall. And it basically annihilates the NFL for the Deflategate scandal. There are, I think, nearly 2 hours of scientists, lawyers, and professors debunking the theory that Brady or anyone deflated footballs in the 2014 conference championship game. First of all, have you heard of it? Secondly, have you seen it? And thirdly, what do you think of the idea?
I've heard about it and I've read about it. I haven't seen it, but I do want to see it. And without any real scientific research behind me, I, from the beginning, was writing this was a bunch of garbage when it first came out in 2015. And I'm not sure where you guys stood on it, but I just didn't think there was anything to it. And I think as the years have gone on, I think a lot of us have come to realize that if the balls were indeed deflated, it was probably because it was a pretty cold day in New England that day, and it was raining out, and the natural gas law?
Yeah, that's right.
Probably more responsible for it than any of those Patriots equipment guys that they claimed put a needle to the ball and let the air out. So, I'll tell you this. One of the reasons I really believe that Brady didn't do it, and I still believe it to this day, is about 3 months later. And at this point, I was already writing. I thought it was a bunch of garbage. But what really convinced me, I was sitting in Robert Kraft's office. And I haven't really told this story before. I was sitting in his office, and he says to me, and we started talking about Deflategate. And he goes, the morning after Deflategate, Tom was sitting exactly where you're sitting. So Kraft was behind his desk. I was just sitting in front of the desk. And he says, Tom, just tell me now. If you did anything, just tell me now. I'm going to get on the phone with Roger. We're going to be forthcoming with him. And I'll make this go away before anything really gets out of control here. We'll fess up to it. We'll say it was a mistake, that this and that, whatever it is, tell me now, and I'll take care of it for you. And he said that Brady looked him in the eye and swore on the life of his children that he didn't know about it and that he didn't do that he didn't have anything to do with it, and he didn't know about it and had no idea how those balls got deflated. He swore on the life of his children. And I know, as being a father, that if I'm going to ever swear on the life of my children, I better damn well be telling the truth.
Yeah, no,
I
agree
thought
with you.
that was so powerful.
Yeah.
That I just can't imagine knowing Tom the way I've gotten to know him over the years. And listen, mainly it was during the final years in New England. And the last few years my contact with him hasn't been the same. But getting to know him the way that I did and knowing how he feels about his family and his kids and his parents and how he was brought up, and having his own father tell me that there's no way his son did this, I just reverted to like my instincts here in trusting people and counting on people being forthcoming and truthful, basic human nature. And that's why I believed him. And maybe I'm being naive. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, honestly, I was outraged by it, and I wrote about that. And my wife got sick and tired of hearing about it. She said, "Let's move on to a different subject." I said, "They've railroaded this guy. They've railroaded him. I don't understand this." And we were living in Manhattan at the time, and I was talking to somebody who is very high in the NFL office, and he said, "What are we doing here? What are we doing? We've got the poster boy for the league, and we're dragging this thing through the mud. What are we doing? Just, I don't care. Fine him $25,000 and make it go away. But instead, we keep it in front of the public, and we really don't have a case." And it ultimately came down to, does Roger Goodell have the power to suspend him or not? And the answer is yeah. I mean, the CBA gave him that power. But it was based, to me, on really nothing. There was just such flimsy evidence, and science was used to basically come to the conclusion that they already come to. But that said, to me, there was something very positive that came out of that. And that was a commercial that ran afterwards. And I think it might have been a year later. So anyway, during his suspension, the 4-game suspension, was a Foot Locker commercial, and was outstanding. And if you don't remember it, and Ira doesn't remember it, I want you to listen to it right now, because Ian's got it. Ian, let's take a listen to it.
Week of Greatness brought it again for the 5th year.
How is it possible it keeps getting better even after all these years?
Kind of makes you wonder what Foot Locker is up to.
You know, that's an unfortunate mindset you got there.
Tom Brady.
Just because something's great year after year doesn't mean anything's going on. Why can't some things just be great?
Just a question.
It starts with questions, and then questions turn into assumptions, and then assumptions turn into vacations. So why would you punish the Week of Greatness for something that never even happened? I lost my appetite.
It's a great ad. It was a great ad. Unfortunately, we don't have the visual, but a great ad. And honestly, when I saw that, that convinced me, because he doesn't do many commercials. You know that. Like you said, Manny does a ton of stuff. He really doesn't. But when I saw that, he was so outraged, and he wanted to go on TV with that. And I thought the emotion was genuine. And when he said, why would you do that? It's a good question. Why would you do that? I have no idea. To this day, I have no idea.
I want to ask you guys a question here. And I've been thinking about this the last couple of days. You heard that story came out where, his dad was in the hospital for 18 days for COVID, and his mom, who's a cancer survivor, contracted it also early September. And then I watched Brady on the sidelines. And Ira, maybe you know this, maybe somebody asked him this question during the season. You watch Brady on the sidelines during the games, and you see him on the field hugging players after games, and he's not wearing a mask. Considering that it only makes, for health reasons, first of all, everybody should wear a mask. We know that. And then considering that his father was in the hospital for 18 days with coronavirus. If he wasn't wearing a mask before that, on the field in these situations, then certainly during the season, he should have been wearing a mask. When he went and shook hands and hugged players after games, or just sitting on the bench. Ira, you've been around him virtually this year. I mean, how do you explain a bright guy like this who has personal experience now to rely on, that his parents were pretty sick, his father was in the hospital for more than 2 weeks? How can he not wear a mask and then go home after a game to his wife and kids? I don't understand that.
Maybe he's got a sense, Gary, a misguided sense that he's Tom Brady and nothing can happen to him. But having said that, Gary, you can transmit it to other people too. And you're right.
Of course.
That's right, sure.
And he sits on that bench and he looks at that iPad, Gary, when the defense is on the field, no mask. And the Bucs are very strict about protocols, especially with a 68-year-old head coach, Gary. So it's a real mystery. I might ask him that this week if I can squeeze my way onto that Zoom call, Gary.
You know, watching him after games, hugging players in the Packers that I would have to think he doesn't know. I mean, no player knows all the other players on another team. And, you know, then going over to the stands and hugging his son, who fortunately had a mask on. And I don't think Aaron Rodgers had a mask. He had his helmet on, which doesn't really provide you with much protection. And then, you know, hugging Bruce Arians, like you just mentioned, a 68-year-old coach who's had some health problems over the years. I would have to think that in the facility, you know, Monday through Friday or whatever it is now, Wednesday through Friday or Wednesday through Saturday, that he's got to wear a mask, because I think they're pretty strict about that. And the NFL has cameras set up that can actually see if there's anybody violating the protocols. But I don't get it. He hasn't been criticized for it this year. Again, I don't get it. I just don't understand. When you think, I don't know how many people watched that game the other day against Green Bay. You know, 40 million people, maybe 150 million or so are going to watch the Super Bowl. It could be the most watched Super Bowl ever. Tom Brady is a role model. Mm-hmm. There are kids watching this game and saying, you know, why do I have to wear a mask? Tom Brady's not wearing a mask. And he's taken his responsibility so seriously as a role model over the years. Again, I hate to keep saying it. I just don't get it. And especially when something hits so close to home with his parents, that he's still not taking what you'd think to be every precaution possible to make sure he doesn't get it. Because we know there are players that are playing games that haven't been diagnosed yet, because it can see the body for a few days. Why would you take that chance? It's hard enough playing the game, you know, and getting tackled on a guy laying on top of you that you're not wearing a mask then, so there's nothing you can do to prevent it. But there are certain situations, you know, on the bench after games, greeting players from other teams, that you can certainly take every precaution. And I just don't understand why he hasn't been doing it, and why there are a bunch of players that haven't been doing it.
Yeah, I don't understand either. And I guess we're going to have to wait on Ira asking that question next week.
Yeah,
Ira?
I really hope you get to ask him, Ira.
I'll raise my hand and I demand recognition. Gary, who you picking?
Yeah, who wins,
picking,
Gary?
Well, I was gonna tell you, don't do what Clark did on the Hall of Fame call when they say hit the raise the hand button, and he starts raising his hand.
I was going like this. I don't have the button on my machine. I'm going over here.
Who you picking, Gary?
You know what? I would have been really interested to see, and this is like probably number 999 on the horrible things that have happened during the pandemic. It is so far down the list we can't see it. But I would have really liked to see what the crowd would have been like with a home team playing in the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
And whether the Buck fans would have flooded the secondary market and it would have been 85% Buck fans, or whether it would have been a usual corporate crowd and made it a real home field advantage. That being said, I mean, I really think that the Chiefs are unstoppable. But the reason I'm going to pick the Bucs in this game is I just think in this very bizarre and unique season, Tom Brady at the age of 43 in his first year with the team, the first time a home team has ever played, a team has ever played a Super Bowl on its home field. I just think that it's the perfect way to end this season. And besides, if you go back to the game, and more of an Exodus point of view, if you go back to the game they played November 29th, when for some reason Tyreek Hill in Todd Bowles' game plan was being singled up for the first quarter, and he had 7 catches for 203 yards and 3 touchdowns, which is unbelievable. I think to that point, no player had 200 yards in a game the wide receiver, and Tyreek Hill got it in the first quarter, for God's sakes. And then they doubled him the rest of the game. And he had 3 catches for 66 yards and a touchdown, which is still a good game, but it's not quite what he did in the first quarter. I think that the Bucs are really going to go to school on that first game and figure out a way to control Hill, who is so explosive and so fast. And if they get the safeties back, if both of them are healthy, I think they'll be able to keep him under control. And then I think the Bucs offense can be just as explosive as Kansas City's offense if Tampa Bay can prevent Hill from just, going 70 yards after a 15-yard catch. So I think it's going to be a very high-scoring game. 3 of the 4 games that Brady and Mahomes have played against each other have been wild shootouts. I think this could be the same. But I just kind of feel the ending to the season will be with Brady holding the trophy.
The only problem is Ira reminds us all the time, Gary, is you take away Hill, then you got Kelsey. He's a problem. And Buffalo discovered that.
Yeah, but, I agree with you there, Clark, but Kelsey is incredibly productive, but he's not explosive like Hill.
No, that's right.
Games from their own 10-yard line. Kelsey will make a 35-yard catch.
Right.
Hill will take that catch and go 90 yards. So I think he's the key to stopping him. And then you don't know what their running game is going to be either. If they'll have some player, Hilaire and Edwards-Hilaire and Le'Veon Bell, if those guys will be back for that game.
Hey, Gary, you want to tell our listeners about your podcast?
Sure. You can get it wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Where you can get Clark and Ira's podcast. You can get mine's on Apple and really all the different podcast sites. It's called The GOAT Tom Brady. And I'm getting ready to go tape this week's episode, which is going to be with Tom Brady Sr. I talked to him. And Dan Shaughnessy, the columnist in the Boston Globe, I spoke with him just about what the reaction is in Boston about Brady getting to a Super Bowl without Belichick and the Patriots. And then the rest of the podcast, episodes 1 through 12, are really just taking the listeners on a journey through Brady's career with a lot of the interviews that I did for my Brady Manning book. The podcast really brings the book to life because then you can hear the interviews yourselves. And I think it's kind of a fun listen, just like your podcast is a fun listen.
So you're not going to get Belichick on this week?
No.
That was a joke, Gary.
No, I want to tell you that I sat next to Belichick at the Blue Ribbon panel thing in Canton.
Yeah, I couldn't get a word in with Belichick because you were jarring with him for 3 hours.
Let me tell you something, Ira. 9 hours. It's the first time I'd spoken to him in more than 20 years.
Wow.
He and I were not exactly exchanging holiday cards up to that point. And when he sat down next to me, he had already had his loose leaf binders down there. I didn't realize it was him when I sat down. Remember, it was me, then Barry, and you were on the other side.
Yes.
Of Barry. And I just decided, listen, you only talk to the people, on either side of you because you can kind of whisper during the conversations. I'm going, if he's not talking to me and I'm not talking to him, all I got left to talk to is Barry, and he's got John Zarnecki on the other side. I'm just going to say hello to him. And if he wants to ignore me, then so be it. We had the best time. I'm telling you, I had a great time talking to him off and on for 9 hours. It was really a lot of fun. I saw a side of him I hadn't seen since his early days coaching the Giants.
Yeah, he told us he really enjoyed his time with Larry Myers.
Yeah, I was going to say, he probably has forgotten that he even spoke to. To tell you the truth, I actually exchanged about 5 different emails with him over the last few months.
Wow.
Nothing since the season started when they started losing. But I wanted him to come on this podcast. I mean, I asked him, I thought, my newfound best friend would come on with me, but he used all kinds of excuses why he didn't think it would be appropriate. So be it.
Clark, I was trying to get Belichick to give me a quote on John Lynch that I can bring into the darn Zoom call. And every time I look up, he's engaged with Gary Myers. I never seen anything like it.
Yeah.
Well, last year we didn't have a Zoom call. Last year we did it in person.
No, I'm saying I could use on this Zoom call
on this
last week.
Oh, on this Zoom call. Well, no, I mean, it was just the one day I talked to him. You had another 364 days to get a hold of him.
Well, by the time I finally got him when the food came out and you let him go for a minute, Gary, I asked him about Lynch and he says, John Lynch. I'm trying to get Rodney Harrison in. Step aside. Next question.
I do want to tell you this in all honesty, guys. He initiated conversations with me during those 9 hours as much, if not more, than I did with him. He was very curious about the process. He had a lot of very good questions. He was asking me why Tagliabue wasn't in at that point. He was very engaged that day. I'm really glad I wound up sitting next to him, because not only did it break the ice on our relationship, but I asked him a bunch of questions that I found his answers, very educational.
Gary Myers, host of the GOAT Tom Brady podcast, and apparently future host of the GOAT Bill Belichick podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us. And I would say we'll see you in Tampa, but I'm not going to be there. These two guys will.
I'm not going to be there either. But,
yeah, well, you'll see them in the stand somewhere cheering. I know Ian will be making a noise for himself. But anyway, Gary, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, it's my pleasure, guys. Anytime.
Yeah, that was fun. That was Hall of Fame voter Gary Myers, who, as we should know by now, is a Tom Brady podcast. And Ira, you're in Tampa. Next move. When are we getting Tom Brady on this podcast?
I'm working on it. First, I'm going to ask him why he's not wearing a mask, and I immediately segue into, hey, Clark Judge. Come on, we need you, Tommy.
That should do it. I'll just tell you, I'm not going to stay up waiting. Hey, Ira, that's going to do it for today. But we're going to be back tomorrow. You want to tell listeners who we've got?
I believe we have the man that earned the nickname The Don, D-O-N, from The Godfather, when he was playing for 14 seasons.
We got Al Pacino?
In a Buck uniform, and he's got a gold jacket. He might be wearing it tomorrow. His name's Derek Brooks, and we're going to welcome him to our podcast tomorrow.
Yeah, I look forward to it, and you should too. This is the Talk of Fame. No, it's not. It's the eye test for two. I've done that 2 weeks in a row. I've done that 2 weeks in a row. Anyway, yeah, that sounds good, Ira. I'm looking forward to it, and you should too. This is the Eye Test for Two podcast. We want to thank you.
And you can find me, Clark. You can find me at iKaufman76.
Oh, and where's Ian?
I'm at IGLEN31 and getting ready for more work to edit that out.
And I'm Clark Judge at Clark Judge TOF. Anyway, this is the Eye Test for Two podcast, and thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.